They said he wasn't fit to wear the American uniform. They said men of his race lacked the discipline, the courage, and the intelligence to serve in combat. The United States Army was so ashamed of him that they refused to let him fight alongside white soldiers, shipping him off to the French command like a piece of unwanted surplus. They handed him a foreign rifle, put him in a lonely listening post in the Argonne forest, and expected him to run at the first sign of trouble. But on a moonless night in 1918, when 24 elite German stormtroopers crawled through the wire to take him alive, they made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they were ambushing a frightened laborer. They didn't realize they had walked into a cage with a lion. When his rifle jammed, he didn't surrender. He used it as a club until the wood shattered in his hands. And when he had nothing left but a bolo knife, he carved his way into history. He was shot, stabbed, and blasted with grenades. He suffered 21 separate wounds. And yet, he didn't fall. He single-handedly liquidated the enemy squad and saved his wounded partner from capture. The French would call him Black Death. His own country would let him die in poverty, erasing his name for a century. This is the story of Henry Johnson. To understand the fury of the Harlem Hellfighters, you must first meet the man who fought an entire German platoon with a knife, and won. Henry Johnson's story traveled from the streets of Albany to the forests of France. I want to know where you are standing. Watch from today. Whether you are in Chicago, Berlin, Lagos, or a small town in the Deep South, drop your city in the comments below. Let's build a global roll call for the man the Army tried to forget. To understand the rage that fueled Henry Johnson that night, you have to understand the world that made him. He wasn't born a killer. He was born a worker. He was a red cap, a porter at the train station in Albany, New York. He spent his days carrying the luggage of white passengers, smiling, taking tips, making himself invisible. He was a small man, barely 5'4", weighing 130 pounds, soaking wet. To the casual observer, he was just another face in the crowd of the Great Migration. But beneath the porter's uniform was a spirit that was tired of being invisible. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the country was a paradox. President Woodrow Wilson declared that America must fight to make the world safe for democracy. Yet, at home, Black Americans were being lynched in the streets. They were denied the vote. They were segregated in every aspect of life. Henry Johnson enlisted on June 5th, 1917. He joined the 15th New York Infantry, an all-black National Guard unit that would later be redesignated as the 369th Infantry Regiment. They would become known to the world as the Harlem Hellfighters. But the U.S. Army didn't want them. From the moment they put on the uniform, the men of the 369th were treated as a problem, not an asset. They were sent to training camps in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where the local white population was hostile to the point of violence. Shopkeepers refused to serve them. Civilians pushed them off the sidewalks. The white soldiers from other units called them night fighters and tin soldiers. The tension was so high that the Army leadership, fearing a race riot similar to the one in Houston, decided to ship the 369th to France early. Not to fight, but just to get them out of the country. They arrived in Brest, France, in late 1917, and immediately the American command put them to work, not as soldiers, as stevedores. For months, Henry Johnson and his brothers unloaded ships. They dug latrines. They built docks. They were treated as labor troops. The American Expeditionary Force, AEF, led by General John J. Pershing, had a strict policy. Black troops were not to be used in combat alongside white troops. Pershing believed that black men lacked the intelligence and the courage to face modern warfare. He wrote a secret memo to the French military, known as the Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops, warning the French not to treat the black soldiers as equals, lest it spoil them for their return to America. But the French didn't care about American racism. The French army was bleeding to death. They had lost millions of men at Verdun and the Somme. They needed bodies to hold the line. They didn't care what color those bodies were. So, in a move that saved the 369th from obscurity, Pershing loaned the regiment to the French army. Henry Johnson was told to turn in his American equipment. He was given a French helmet, the Adrian. He was given a French rifle, the Liebel. He was given French rations, wine, and hard bread. He was told that he was now, for all intents and purposes, a French soldier. This was a transformative moment. For the first time in his military career, Henry Johnson was treated with respect. The French officers didn't call him boy. They called him soldat. They taught him how to use grenades. They taught him about trench warfare. They welcomed him into the Brotherhood of Arms. And then they sent him to the Argonne forest. The Argonne was a nightmare landscape. It was a dense, ancient forest that had been blasted into a moonscape by 3 years of artillery fire. The trees were shattered stumps. The ground was a maze of mud, craters, and barbed wire. It was quiet, a ghost front. But the silence was deceptive. The Germans were there, watching, waiting, probing the lines for weakness. The 369th was assigned to a sector known as Outpost 20. It was the tip of the spear, a small, isolated position forward of the main French line. It was a listening post. The job was simple. Sit in the dark, listen for the enemy, and if they come, sound the alarm and die so the main line has time to wake up. On the night of May 14th, Henry Johnson drew the short straw. He was on guard duty. His partner was Needham Roberts, a teenager from New Jersey. The night was moonless. It was raining, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked into the wool uniforms. The mud was knee-deep. Johnson and Roberts stood in the small, fortified dugout, peering into the blackness of no man's land. They were tired. They were wet. They were thousands of miles from home, fighting for a country that wouldn't let them buy a sandwich in a drugstore. Around 2:01 a.m., the sounds of the night changed. The birds had stopped singing hours ago. But now, Johnson heard something else. A snip. Then another snip. It was the sound of wire cutters. Johnson stiffened. He whispered to Roberts, "You hear that?" Roberts nodded. He grabbed a box of grenades. The snipping got closer. It was methodical, professional. The Germans were cutting a path through the barbed wire defenses. Johnson couldn't see them yet, but he could feel them. He knew this wasn't a stray patrol. This was a raid. He reached for the signal flare gun. He aimed it at the sky and pulled the trigger. The flare hissed upward, bathing the forest in a stark, blinding white light. And there they were. In the sudden illumination, Johnson saw gray uniforms. Dozens of them. They were in the wire. They were on the parapet. They were everywhere. The Germans, realizing they were spotted, opened fire. A volley of bullets slammed into the dugout. A grenade landed at Roberts' feet. Boom! The explosion threw Roberts against the wall of the trench. His hip was shattered. He collapsed, screaming in agony, unable to stand. Henry Johnson was alone. He grabbed his rifle. He fired into the mass of gray shapes. He dropped one German. He worked the bolt. He fired again. But the Germans were rushing him. They were the Stormtroopers. They were armed with Luger pistols, grenades, and trench knives. They swarmed the small outpost like army ants. Johnson fired until his magazine was empty. He tried to reload. He shoved a fresh clip of French ammunition into the Liebel. And then, the click. The cartridge jammed. The bolt wouldn't close. A German soldier, seeing the black man struggle with his weapon, lunged forward. He swung his rifle butt at Johnson's head. This is the moment where history holds its breath. This is the moment where a man decides if he is a victim or a legend. Henry Johnson dropped the jammed rifle. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't beg for mercy. He reached to his hip. He felt the cold, wooden handle of his bolo knife. He roared, and the Battle of Henry Johnson began. The trench was narrow. It was wet, and it was now a cage match between Henry Johnson and the German Empire. When the rifle jammed, most men would have frozen. The psychological shock of a weapon failing in the face of death is usually fatal. But Henry Johnson didn't have time to freeze. He shifted his grip. He grabbed the barrel of the French Lebel rifle, the wood hot from the firing, and he swung it like a baseball bat. The stock of the rifle connected with the head of the German soldier lunging at him. There was a sickening crack, the sound of walnut wood shattering against a human skull. The German dropped like a stone. Johnson swung again. He smashed the rifle into another attacker, driving him back. The force of the blows was so violent that the rifle stock disintegrated, leaving Johnson holding nothing but a bent metal barrel. He was now unarmed, but the Germans kept coming. They poured over the lip of the trench, gray shapes dropping into the mud. They were big men, well-fed stormtroopers, handpicked for their aggression. They swarmed Johnson. One soldier grabbed him by the neck. Another tried to tackle him around the waist. Johnson reached for his hip. His hand closed around the textured wooden handle of his bolo knife. The bolo is not a combat knife. It is an agricultural tool. It is heavy, weighted forward, with a thick, curved blade designed to chop through sugar cane and thick brush. It is a tool of labor. But in the hands of Henry Johnson that night, it became a tool of liberation. He drew the blade. He didn't slash wildly. He fought with a terrifying, primal efficiency. He drove the knife up into the stomach of the man holding his neck. He twisted it. The German screamed and let go. Johnson spun around. A German officer was standing over Needham Roberts, who was lying in the mud, bleeding from his shattered hip. The officer had a Luger pistol aimed at Roberts' head. He was about to execute him. Johnson didn't think. He launched himself across the trench. He landed on the officer's back, driving the bolo knife down through the man's skull. The officer crumpled. Johnson pulled the blade free and turned to the next threat. He was a blur of motion. He was cutting, stabbing, punching, and biting. He was fighting with every limb, but the Germans were fighting back. A bullet struck Johnson in the side. It punched through his ribs. He grunted, but he didn't stop. Another bullet hit his hand. Shrapnel from a grenade peppered his legs. A German bayonet slashed his arm. He was bleeding from 21 different wounds. His uniform was soaked. His boots were slipping in a slurry of mud and blood. The pain should have incapacitated him. The blood loss should have made him faint. But adrenaline is a powerful drug, and rage is even stronger. Henry Johnson was fueled by a lifetime of being told he was small, a lifetime of being told he was weak, a lifetime of carrying bags for white men who didn't look him in the eye. In that trench, for the first time in his life, he was the biggest man in the world. He was the master of his environment. He saw the Germans trying to lift Needham Roberts. They were dragging the wounded teenager toward the wire, intending to take him prisoner. To Johnson, this was unacceptable. Roberts wasn't just a soldier. He was a brother. He was family. Johnson charged them. He took a shot to the thigh, but kept moving. He tackled the two Germans, dragging Roberts. He slashed the tendons in the legs of one, dropping him to the ground. He gutted the other. The violence was intimate. It was breath on breath, sweat on sweat. It was the sound of metal tearing cloth and flesh. Needham Roberts, despite his horrific injuries, wasn't done either. He lay in the mud, unable to stand, but he grabbed German grenades that had landed in the trench and threw them back. He handed Johnson fresh clips before the rifle broke. He shouted warnings. "Behind you, Henry. Left." They were a two-man army, one crippled, one bleeding to death, holding off a platoon. The Germans began to panic. They were elite troops. They were used to order, to tactics, to enemies who fought by the book. They were not used to this. They were not used to a demon who wouldn't die. Every time they shot him, he got back up. Every time they stabbed him, he laughed, a guttural, terrifying sound, and swung that heavy knife again. Psychologically, the Germans broke. They began to scream. The Black Death, the devil. They realized that the cost of taking this outpost was too high. They had lost their officer. They had lost their point men. The element of surprise was gone. The flare was fading, plunging the trench back into darkness. And in that darkness, Johnson was the predator. A German whistle blew, the retreat signal. The surviving stormtroopers scrambled out of the trench. They dragged some of their wounded with them, leaving trails of blood through the wire. They ran back toward the German lines, terrified, leaving their dead behind. Henry Johnson stood in the trench. He was swaying. He was gasping for air. His bolo knife was notched and dull. His hands were slick with red. He looked at Needham Roberts. "You okay, Needham?" Roberts looked up at the man who had just saved his life. He saw the holes in Johnson's uniform. He saw the blood pooling in his boots. "I'm alive, Henry," he whispered. "I'm alive." Then, the adrenaline crashed. Johnson's legs gave out. He slid down the wall of the trench, sitting in the mud. The pain, held back by the fury of the fight, came rushing in all at once. His side burned. His head throbbed. He looked at his hands and wondered if they were still attached to his body. He didn't know if he was going to live. He just knew that he hadn't let them take the post. And he hadn't let them take Needham. Silence returned to the Argonne forest. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood off the leaves. It wasn't until dawn that the French relief column arrived. When the French officers looked into Outpost 20, they stopped in their tracks. They saw the carnage. They found 4 dead German soldiers in the trench. They found rifles smashed to pieces. They found helmets split open. They followed the trail of blood back toward the German lines and estimated that at least 20 other men had been wounded or killed and dragged away. And in the middle of it all, they found 2 black Americans. One was unconscious. The other was barely breathing. The French commander looked at Henry Johnson. He looked at the bolo knife. He looked at the 24 sets of German boot prints. He did the math. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre, and one man had won it. The French evacuated Johnson and Roberts to a field hospital. The doctors who treated Johnson were astounded. He had been shot, stabbed, and bludgeoned. His body was a map of violence. They counted the wounds. 21. Word of the Battle of Henry Johnson spread like wildfire through the Allied lines. The French soldiers, who already respected the 369th, began to treat Johnson like a saint. They brought him wine in the hospital. They brought him flowers. To the French, he was the embodiment of the warrior spirit. They didn't care about his race. They cared that he had killed Boches. But the reaction from the American command was different. When General Pershing heard about the incident, there was a moment of awkward silence. This didn't fit the narrative. The official U.S. Army report on Negro troops stated that they were cowardly and prone to panic. Henry Johnson had just disproved the entire philosophy of the segregated army in under 60 minutes. The Americans didn't know what to do with him. If they gave him the Medal of Honor, they would have to admit that a black man was the bravest soldier in France. That would cause problems back home. That would upset the white Southern officers. So they did nothing. The American government ignored the event. They filed a report, categorized it as a skirmish, and moved on. There was no Purple Heart. It hadn't been revived yet, but there was no wound chevron offered immediately. There was no Distinguished Service Cross, but the French were not bound by American racism. General Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander, ordered a citation. He awarded Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts the Croix de Guerre. It was France's highest military honor. And to make it even more significant, they added the Gold Palm. This meant the award was for gallantry in action of the highest order. Henry Johnson became the first American soldier in World War I, black or white, to receive this honor. Imagine the scene. A French general standing by the hospital bed of a black train porter from Albany. He pins the medal on Johnson's hospital gown. He kisses him on both cheeks. He salutes. It was a moment of profound validation. But it was also a moment of profound shame for the United States. A foreign power had to honor an American hero because his own country was too paralyzed by bigotry to do it. Johnson lay in that bed, fingering the medal. He was proud, but he was also in agony. His body would never fully recover. The shattered foot, the internal injuries. He was a broken vessel, but he was about to be used one last time. The Army realized that, despite their discomfort, Johnson was a PR goldmine. The story was leaking out. The black press in America was running headlines. The Black Death. The hero of the Argonne. The Army decided to bring him home. Not to give him a pension, but to use him as a prop to sell war bonds. They wanted to parade him around, show off his French medal, and tell the black community, see, if you fight for us, you can be a hero too. Henry Johnson was put on a ship. He was sailing back to a hero's welcome in Harlem. But he was also sailing back to a country that hadn't changed. He was sailing back to the Jim Crow laws, the red summer of 1919, and the cold shoulder of the Veterans Bureau. The Battle of the Argonne was over. The battle for Henry Johnson's soul was just beginning. When the troop transport Stockholm steamed into New York Harbor in February 1919, the city held its breath. The war was over. The boys were coming home. But the 369th Infantry Regiment wasn't just any unit. They were the Harlem Hellfighters. They were the unit that had spent 191 days in combat, more than any other American regiment. They were the unit that never lost a foot of ground and never lost a man to capture. And standing on the deck, leaning heavily on a cane, was the man who had become the face of their ferocity, Henry Johnson. New York City gave them a welcome that has never been equaled. On February 17, 1919, the regiment formed up to march up Fifth Avenue. It was a spectacle of American power and black pride. The regimental band, led by the legendary James Reese Europe, struck up a jazz rhythm that bounced off the skyscrapers. The music was electric. It was the sound of the jazz age being born in the middle of a victory lap. 3,000 black soldiers marched in perfect formation. Their French helmets gleamed. Their bayonets caught the winter sun. The crowds were estimated in the millions. White New Yorkers leaned out of office windows, raining ticker tape and confetti down on the men they had once despised. Black New Yorkers lined the sidewalks of Harlem, weeping, cheering, holding up their babies to see the men who had proven that black blood was red and that it had saved the world. But Henry Johnson didn't march. He couldn't. His foot, shattered by the German rifle butt and the subsequent surgeries, was a ruin. The 21 wounds he had suffered in the Argonne had left him permanently disabled. He had a metal plate in his foot. He was in constant, grinding pain. So the Army put him in a convertible. He rode at the head of the parade, standing in the back of an open car, clutching a bouquet of lilies. He wore his uniform. Pinned to his chest was the Croix de Guerre with the golden palm. The crowd went insane when they saw him. "The Black Death," they screamed. The hero of the Argonne. For a few hours on a cold Monday in February, Henry Johnson was the most famous man in America. Theodore Roosevelt, the former president, had written that Johnson was one of the 5 bravest Americans to serve in the war. The newspapers called him a Superman. The army used his image on recruitment posters. He was the proof that the system worked. He was the proof that a black man could serve his country and be rewarded with love and adoration. But it was all a lie, and Henry Johnson knew it. As he waved to the crowd, he knew that he had no job to go back to. He knew that his injuries meant he could no longer work as a red cap porter. He couldn't carry the heavy bags. He knew that the United States Army had discharged him without a disability file. There was no pension waiting for him. There was no medical care waiting for him at the VA. The cheers were free. The survival cost money. And Henry Johnson had none. But the government wasn't done with him yet. They saw his celebrity as a tool. The war was over, but the debt was high. The government needed to sell Victory Liberty bonds. They needed a hero to go on tour, to stand on stages, and to tell the public to give their money to Uncle Sam. They hired Henry Johnson. They put him on a train. They sent him to Boston, to Washington, to St. Louis. He was a traveling exhibit. Come see the man who killed 24 Germans. At first, Johnson played the game. He stood on the stages. He smiled. He told the sanitized version of the story, the version where he was a brave patriot fighting for democracy. The crowds ate it up. He was a novelty, a black man who was allowed to be a hero as long as he stayed in character. But inside, the pressure was building. While Johnson was touring, the red summer of 1919 was beginning to burn. White mobs were attacking black communities across the country. In Elaine, Arkansas, black sharecroppers were massacred. In Chicago, a black boy was stoned to death for swimming in the white part of Lake Michigan, sparking a riot that burned down neighborhoods. Black veterans were being lynched in their uniforms. Johnson read the papers. He saw the hypocrisy. He was selling bonds for a government that couldn't or wouldn't stop its citizens from murdering his people. He was telling black audiences to support the army, while he knew how the army had treated him in France. He remembered the white Marines who refused to fight alongside him. He remembered the white officers who called him the N-word while he was bleeding on a stretcher. He remembered the supplies that never came. The cognitive dissonance was tearing him apart. He was a man of integrity, a man who had faced death without blinking. How could he stand on a stage and lie? The breaking point came in St. Louis. It was March 1919. A massive crowd had gathered. The hall was packed with black citizens, eager to hear the hero. The white organizers sat in the front row, smiling, expecting the standard speech. Buy bonds. Support the flag. America is great. Henry Johnson walked up to the podium. He leaned on his cane. He looked at the faces in the crowd. Faces that looked like his. Faces that knew the struggle. And he went off script. He didn't talk about glory. He didn't talk about democracy. He talked about the truth. The white man, Johnson thundered, his voice echoing in the shocked silence of the hall, read about the war in the papers. But we lived it. He told them about the racism. He told them about the white soldiers who ran away when the shelling started. He told them about the Marines, the vaunted U.S. Marines, who refused to go into the trenches with black troops. The white Marines, Johnson said, refused to go on the line with us. They said they wouldn't fight with colored soldiers. But when the Germans started coming, those white boys ran like rabbits. And it was us, the colored boys, who held the line. He stripped the varnish off the war. He told the crowd that the French were the only ones who treated them like men. He told them that the American officers were racists who cared more about segregation than victory. He told them that the Great War for Democracy was a sham for the black soldier. The reaction in the room was a mix of gasps and electric cheers. The black audience was hearing something they had suspected, but never heard spoken aloud by a hero. They were hearing the raw, unpolished reality of their existence. But the reaction in the front row was different. The white organizers were horrified. The army liaisons were furious. They tried to signal him to stop. They tried to cut him off. Johnson didn't stop. He finished his speech. He walked off the stage with his head held high. He had just committed professional suicide. The backlash was instantaneous. The next day, the headlines weren't about his heroism. They were about his insolence. They called him ungrateful. They called him a liar. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat ran a scathing article accusing him of slandering white troops. The army moved fast. They canceled the rest of his tour. They stripped him of his celebrity status. There would be no more paid speeches. There would be no more dinners. They put a flag on his file, a literal or metaphorical mark that said, "Troublemaker. Do not help." Henry Johnson had dared to speak truth to power, and power responded by turning off the lights. He returned to Albany, New York. The parades were over. The confetti had been swept away. He was 32 years old. He was crippled. He had no money. And now he had enemies in high places. He tried to go back to work. He took a job at the train station, but he couldn't lift the bags. His foot was in constant agony. He tried to get his disability pension from the Veterans Bureau. They denied him. They claimed that his injuries were not service-connected. Think about the insanity of that statement. He had been shot and stabbed 21 times by German soldiers in a trench in France while wearing a U.S. Army uniform. And the government claimed it wasn't service-connected. Why? Because on his discharge papers, in the chaos of his return, a clerk had failed to note his wounds. Or perhaps the clerk had been ordered to leave them out. Without the paperwork, the bureaucracy said he was fine. It was a slow-motion execution. The government couldn't kill him in St. Louis, so they decided to starve him in Albany. Johnson's life began a rapid, tragic spiral. The pain in his body was constant. He couldn't afford doctors. He began to self-medicate. Alcohol became his painkiller. It dulled the ache in his foot and the rage in his heart. His marriage fell apart. His wife, who had welcomed a hero home, found herself living with a broken, bitter man who woke up screaming from nightmares of the Argonne. She left him. He ended up living in a small, cold room. He was destitute. The man who had been compared to Theodore Roosevelt was now begging for change on the streets of the city, where he had once been a porter. People walked past him. They saw a drunk with a limp. They didn't see the Black Death. They didn't see the savior of Needham Roberts. They saw a nuisance. Occasionally, a reporter would find him. They would write a "whatever happened to" story. Johnson would tell them, "I fought for this country, and this country doesn't give a damn about me." The stories would run. People would shake their heads in pity, and then they would turn the page. Nothing changed. By 1929, 10 years after the parade, Henry Johnson was dying. His heart was enlarged, a condition called soldier's heart, likely caused by the stress and the alcohol. He weighed less than 110 pounds. He was a skeleton. On July 1st, 1929, Henry Johnson died. He was 32 years old. There was no state funeral this time. There were no generals. He died alone, in a charity hospital. And then the final insult. For decades, historians and even his own family believed that Henry Johnson had been buried in a pauper's grave in Albany, lost to the weeds. It fit the narrative of his tragedy, the hero thrown in the trash. But the Army had done one thing right, almost by accident. Because he was a veteran, he was entitled to a burial. His body was taken to Arlington National Cemetery. He was buried in Section 25, grave 6418. But here is the catch. Nobody knew he was there. Due to a clerical error, a misspelling of his name, or just the sheer indifference of the era, his burial record was lost. His family wasn't told. The public wasn't told. For 70 years, people searched for his grave in New York, lamenting that he had no resting place, while he was actually lying in the most hallowed ground in America, under a stone that nobody visited. He was lost in the middle of the crowd, a forgotten soldier in an army of the dead. The Germans couldn't kill him. The war couldn't kill him. But the silence almost did. But Henry Johnson is not a man who stays buried. For 60 years, the ghost of Henry Johnson haunted the conscience of those who knew the truth. But to the rest of the world, he was dead in more ways than one. He was physically dead, his body consumed by the earth. He was historically dead, his deeds relegated to a few paragraphs in books about Negro history. And he was bureaucratically dead, his file closed, his pension denied, his medals missing. The United States Army operates on paperwork. If it isn't written down, signed, and stamped in triplicate, it didn't happen. And in the case of Henry Johnson, the paperwork was a void. The Army couldn't find his medical records from France. They couldn't find the discharge papers that listed his wounds. They couldn't even find his grave. For decades, the assumption in Albany, New York, was that their hometown hero had been dumped into a pauper's grave, a potter's field, unmarked and unmourned. It was a source of deep local shame. The man who had been paraded down Fifth Avenue was thought to be lying under a patch of weeds, lost forever, but the bloodline did not forget. Henry Johnson had a son, Herman Johnson. Herman didn't know his father well. Henry had left the family when Herman was just a small child, spiraling into the alcoholism and despair that eventually killed him. Herman grew up hearing the stories, the myths of the Black Death, but he also saw the wreckage the war had left behind. And here's the twist of history that makes this story so American. Herman Johnson didn't run from the military that destroyed his father. He joined it. When World War II broke out, Herman enlisted. He became a Tuskegee Airman. Think about the poetry of that. The father was a Harlem Hellfighter, a foot soldier in the mud of WWI. The son was a Red Tail, a pilot in the sky of WW2. Two generations of black men, fighting for the same country, facing the same racism, bound by the same blood. Herman survived the war. He came home. He built a life. But as he grew older, the ghost of his father began to pull at him. He wanted to know the truth. He wanted to know where his father was buried, and he wanted the Medal of Honor. In the 1990s, Herman Johnson, now an old man himself, joined forces with a group of veterans and activists in Albany. They reached out to their politicians. They found a champion in Senator Carl Levin, and later Senator Chuck Schumer. They launched a campaign. It wasn't a military campaign. It was a forensic investigation. They were trying to convict the United States Army of negligence. But the Pentagon fought back with their favorite weapon, the standard of proof. To award a Medal of Honor, the military requires incontestable proof of the deed. Usually, this means 2 eyewitness affidavits and a detailed after-action report. But Henry Johnson's war was 80 years ago. Needham Roberts was dead. The French officers were dead. The German Stormtroopers were dead. The witnesses were dust. We can't give the medal based on a legend, the Pentagon officials said. We need paper. So, the team went hunting for paper. They scoured the archives in Washington. They dug through the dusty boxes of the 369th Infantry. And while they were looking for the battle reports, they found something else. Something that stopped them cold. They found a burial card. It was a small, yellowed index card. It had been sitting in a drawer for 70 years. It bore the name Henry Johnson. It listed his rank. It listed his unit. And it listed his burial location. He wasn't in a pauper's grave in Albany. He wasn't lost in the weeds. He was in Arlington National Cemetery. The revelation was earth-shattering. For 7 decades, his family had believed he was thrown away like trash. But the Army, in a rare moment of competence amidst the negligence, had actually given him a soldier's burial in 1929. He was lying in Section 25, grave 64 and 18. He had been there the whole time, surrounded by generals and presidents. But because of a clerical error, a failure to notify the next of kin, a misspelled name in a ledger, he had been lost in the middle of the most famous cemetery in America. Herman Johnson flew to Washington. He walked into Arlington. He found Section 25, and he stood in front of the white marble stone. It read, Henry Johnson, PVT, 369, NF, 93, DAV. It was simple. It was clean. It was dignified. Herman fell to his knees. He touched the stone. Daddy, he whispered, I found you. It was a moment of profound closure for the son, but it was not justice for the soldier. The stone listed his unit, but it didn't list his awards. There was no gold lettering. There was no mention of the Black Death. The discovery of the grave energized the movement. If the Army had been wrong about the grave, what else were they wrong about? The activists went back to the Pentagon. You lost his body for 70 years, they argued. Now you tell us you can't find his records? Under pressure, the Army agreed to review the file again, and this time they found something they couldn't ignore. They found the medical records. For decades, the government had claimed there was no proof of Johnson's 21 wounds. They said his disability wasn't service-connected. But there, in the archives, was the microfilm. It detailed the gunshot wounds. It detailed the severed tendons. It detailed the shattered foot. It was proof that the denial of his pension had been a lie. It was proof that the government had let a war hero starve to death by ignoring its own documents. In 1996, the first victory was won. In a ceremony at the White House, President Bill Clinton awarded Henry Johnson the Purple Heart. It was a long overdue recognition of his blood. But to Herman Johnson, standing there holding the medal, it felt light. The Purple Heart is for being wounded. It is a medal for suffering. His father hadn't just suffered. He had fought. He had won. This is good, Herman said, but it's not enough. He didn't just bleed. He killed. The fight for the Medal of Honor, the Medal for Valor, intensified, but the Pentagon dug its heels in. They admitted Johnson was brave. They admitted he was wounded, but they stuck to their standard of proof. Without a specific, detailed American after-action report describing the specific acts of gallantry, they wouldn't upgrade the award. They ignored the French Croix de Guerre. They said foreign awards didn't count as primary evidence for a U.S. Medal of Honor. It was a catch-22 designed to fail. The only reason there wasn't an American report was because the Americans had loaned him to the French. The segregation that caused the problem was now being used as the excuse to deny the solution. The team needed a smoking gun. They needed a document written in 1918 by an American officer that explicitly described what Johnson did. It seemed impossible. The archives had been searched. The fire of 1973 in St. Louis had destroyed millions of records. The trail was cold. Herman Johnson passed away in 2004. He died without seeing his father get the Medal of Honor. He died holding the Purple Heart, believing that he had taken the fight as far as it could go. But the story didn't die with the son. A new researcher took up the torch. Her name was Tara Kranzlin, a staffer for Senator Schumer. She wasn't a historian. She was a tenacious investigator who refused to take no for an answer. She went online. She started searching digital archives that hadn't existed when Herman began his quest. She didn't look in the Army files. She looked everywhere else. And in 2011, deep in the digital stacks of the New York State Military Museum, she found it. She found a memo. It wasn't a formal combat report. It was a memo written by General John J. Pershing, the Supreme Commander of the AEF, sent to the War Department in 1918. It was titled, "A Report on the Engagement of Henry Johnson." Pershing had written it himself. He had described the battle. He had confirmed the number of Germans. He had confirmed the broken rifle. He had confirmed the bolo knife. Pershing, the man who had warned the French not to treat black soldiers as equals, had privately documented Henry Johnson's heroism in a memo that had been misfiled for 90 years. It was the smoking gun. It was the voice of the highest authority in the U.S. Army, speaking from the grave, saying, "He did it." With this document, the Pentagon ran out of excuses. The standard of proof had been met. The wall of bureaucracy, built on racism and indifference, finally crumbled. But the wheels of justice grind slow. Even with the Pershing memo, it took another 4 years of reviews, boards, and signatures. Finally, in 2015, the call came. The White House was ready. June 2nd, 2015, the East Room of the White House. The room is gilded, opulent, and heavy with the ghosts of history. It is the room where treaties are signed and bodies lie in state. On this day, it is packed with generals in dress blues, senators in dark suits, and the quiet, reverent descendants of the 369th Infantry Regiment. They are waiting for a moment that should have happened in 1919. President Barack Obama stands at the podium. The symbolism is almost too heavy to process. A black man, the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces, is preparing to honor a black man whom the United States Army once treated as disposal labor. The arc of the moral universe is long, but on this morning, it has finally bent all the way back to justice. But there is an empty chair. Henry Johnson is not there. He has been dead for 86 years. Herman Johnson, the son who fought for this moment, is not there. He has been dead for 11 years. The victory has outlived the victors. So, who accepts the medal? Standing at attention is Command Sergeant Major Lewis Wilson. He is a massive man, a rock of the New York National Guard. He is wearing the modern uniform of the U.S. Army, but he is there to represent the lineage. He is the highest-ranking enlisted soldier in the New York Guard. He is standing in for the private. The room goes silent. The citation is read. For 97 years, the official American record of the night of May 14, 1918, was a blank page. Now, for the first time, the government speaks the truth aloud. The citation recounts the jammed rifle. It recounts the grenades. It recounts the bolo knife. It uses the words conspicuous, gallantry, and intrepidity. We are a nation, President Obama says, that says, we never forget, and we mean it. It is a beautiful sentiment. But to the historians in the room, and to the spirits of the Harlem Hellfighters, it is a complicated one, because the nation did forget. It forgot on purpose. It forgot with malice. When the president places the blue ribbon around the neck of Command Sergeant Major Wilson, the room erupts in applause. The Medal of Honor, the star surrounded by a green laurel wreath, glints under the chandeliers. It is the highest validation a soldier can receive. It means you are in the pantheon. You are immortal. But as the applause washes over the room, one cannot help but think of the cost of that gold. That medal could have bought Henry Johnson a house in 1920. The pension attached to it could have paid for the surgeries to fix his foot. The status of it could have stopped the police from harassing him. It could have saved his marriage. It could have saved his life. Instead, he died sleeping on a cot in a charity hospital, wondering why his country hated him. The Medal of Honor in 2015 is not a reward for Henry Johnson. He is beyond rewards. It is a correction for America. It is the government admitting we were small, we were petty, we were racist, and he was greater than us. The medal does not fix the past. It does not unbreak the bones. It does not undrink the alcohol that numbed the pain, but it does something else. It changes the future. By awarding the medal, the Army forced the rewriting of every military history textbook in the country. From this day forward, every recruit at boot camp who learns the history of the Army has to learn the name, Henry Johnson. They have to learn that a black man set the standard for close quarters combat. The Black Death is no longer a rumor whispered in the jazz clubs of Harlem. He is canon. But Henry Johnson wasn't the only ghost in the room that day. The medal cast a light on the entire unit, the 369th. The Harlem Hellfighters were the most extraordinary unit of the war. They spent 191 days in combat, longer than any white American regiment. They were the first Allied unit to reach the Rhine River. They introduced jazz to Europe, changing the cultural landscape of France forever. And they did it all while wearing French helmets because the U.S. Army refused to issue them American gear. The Medal of Honor for Johnson was a proxy award for the entire regiment. It was an acknowledgement that the Hellfighters were not just a colorful nickname, they were the tip of the spear. After the ceremony, the medal was taken to New York. It wasn't put in a private home. It was put on display in the New York State Military Museum. And then a final physical correction was made. Remember the headstone in Arlington? The simple white marker that Herman Johnson had found? Henry Johnson, PVT. The Army went back to Section 25. They removed that stone. They carved a new one. It stands there today, white and gleaming in the Virginia sun. It still says Henry Johnson. But now, the text is etched in gold leaf, and below his name, it reads, Medal of Honor. It is a beacon. Visitors who walk through Arlington, looking for JFK or the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, now stop at Section 25. They see the gold lettering. They look up the name on their phones, and they read the story of the bolo knife. The erasure is over. The signal flare has been seen. But there is a lingering tragedy in the story of Henry Johnson that we must confront in the final chapters of this saga. It is the tragedy of the one. America loves a singular black hero. It loves a Jackie Robinson, a Martin Luther King, a Henry Johnson. It loves to elevate one man to the status of superhero because it allows the system to say, look, if you are exceptional, you can make it. But what about Needham Roberts? Needham Roberts was in the trench that night too. He was blown up by a grenade. He threw grenades back while unable to stand. He fought until he passed out. He received the Croix de Guerre as well. But Needham Roberts didn't get the Medal of Honor. He is not a household name. He is the sidekick in the Henry Johnson movie. The focus on Johnson's superhuman feat obscures the reality that thousands of black soldiers fought and died in the Argonne forest without recognition. They charged machine gun nests. They held the line against gas attacks. They died in the mud, anonymous and uncelebrated. Henry Johnson is the avatar for all of them. He is the vessel into which we pour our guilt and our gratitude. But we must remember that he was not a solitary giant. He was a soldier in a line of soldiers. He was part of a brotherhood that stretched from the Civil War to the trenches of France. And he was a man, not a symbol. He was a man who liked to dance. He was a man who loved his wife. He was a man who felt pain when it rained. By turning him into a bronze statue, we risk losing the humanity that made his sacrifice so profound. He wasn't a killing machine. He was a terrified young train porter who decided not to die. As we move toward the conclusion of this story, we have to look at what Henry Johnson's life teaches us about the present. We live in an era where we are constantly debating the definition of patriotism. Is it standing for the anthem? Is it wearing a flag pin? Henry Johnson gives us a different definition. Patriotism is fighting for your country, even when your country tells you you don't belong. It is holding the line for a people who would lynch you if you walked into the wrong neighborhood. It is a love so fierce and so complicated that it defies logic. Henry Johnson saved the lives of white Frenchmen and white Americans. He defended the idea of liberty while living in the reality of Jim Crow. He was the ultimate patriot because his loyalty was not transactional. He didn't fight for a reward. He fought because it was who he was. In the next block, we will look at the modern legacy of the Hellfighters. We will see how their DNA exists in the National Guard today. We will look at the cultural impact, the graphic novels, the songs, the potential movies, and we will ask the question, if Henry Johnson were alive today, what would he say to us? We will strip away the gold of the medal and look at the iron of the man one last time. The ceremony is over. The politicians have left the room. The lights are dimmed in the East Room. But the ghost of Henry Johnson is finally, after a century of wandering, at rest. Or is he? Because a hero who died of a broken heart never truly rests until the country he loved fixes the break. And we are still working on the fix. The next block is the legacy, and it is louder than a jazz band on Fifth Avenue. If you walk down Fifth Avenue in Harlem today, near 142nd Street, you will see a fortress. It is a massive brick castle, imposing and impregnable, sitting in the middle of the city. This is the 369th Regiment Armory. It is the spiritual home of the Harlem Hellfighters. Inside, the air is cool and smells of old wood and gun oil. There are murals on the walls depicting black soldiers charging into battle. There are glass cases holding the tattered remains of the flags that flew in the Argonne. And there are modern soldiers, men and women of the New York National Guard, drilling on the floor. The unit still exists. The 369th Sustainment Brigade is the direct descendant of Henry Johnson's regiment. They have deployed to Iraq. They have deployed to Afghanistan. They have served in Mali. When they put on their uniforms, they wear a distinctive unit crest. It features a rattlesnake coiled around a cactus, a nod to their training days on the Mexican border, and the motto, "Don't tread on me." But the real motto, the one stamped on their hearts, is the name Henry Johnson. Every young soldier who walks into that armory knows the story. They know about the jammed rifle. They know about the bolo knife. They know that they are walking in the footsteps of a giant. Henry Johnson didn't just save Needham Roberts. He saved the dignity of every black soldier who would come after him. He set a standard of ferocity that made it impossible for the army to say, "They can't fight." He was the battering ram that cracked the wall of segregation. But as we close this chapter, we must look beyond the military. We must look at what Henry Johnson means to us, the civilians, the citizens, the people living in the America he fought to save. Henry Johnson is the ultimate rebuttal to the imposter syndrome of a marginalized people. For centuries, the narrative was that black people were secondary characters in American history. They were the labor, the victims, the background. Henry Johnson grabbed the pen and wrote himself as the protagonist. He proved that in the ultimate test of human will, hand-to-hand combat against overwhelming odds, a black man was not just equal, he was superior. He teaches us that you do not need rank to be a leader. He was a private. He had no authority. He had no stripes. But when the world fell apart in Outpost 20, he took command of his own destiny. However, his story is also a warning. It is a warning about the cost of loving a country that doesn't love you back. The tragedy of Henry Johnson is not that he died young. It is that he died thinking he had failed. He died believing that his sacrifice was worthless because the government refused to validate it. We cannot fix that pain. We cannot go back to 1929 and hold his hand in that charity hospital. We cannot buy him the house he deserved. The debt is unpaid, and it is unpayable, but we can pay the interest. We pay it by remembering. In recent years, the story of the Harlem Hellfighters has exploded back into the culture. Max Brooks, the author of World War Z, wrote a graphic novel about them. There are talks of movies. The Black Death is becoming a superhero for a new generation. This is vital, because if we don't tell these stories, the vacuum will be filled with lies. We live in an era where history is under attack. There are people who want to ban books, who want to sanitize the past, who want to pretend that racism was a minor glitch rather than a systemic feature. The story of Henry Johnson is a weapon against that ignorance. You cannot look at his 21 wounds and say that racism wasn't real. You cannot look at the 97-year delay for his medal and say that the system was fair. His life is the evidence. So, what would Henry Johnson say if he were here today? If he stood in the East Room in 2015, looking at the president, looking at the medal, what would he think? He probably wouldn't smile. He was a tough man, hardened by a hard life. He might look at the medal and say, "It's about time." But he would also look at us. He would look at the ongoing struggle for voting rights. He would look at the economic disparity. He would look at the fact that black veterans are still fighting for equal benefits. And he would tell us to pick up the knife. Not a literal knife, but the knife of the spirit, the bolo knife of the mind. He would tell us that when your rifle jams, when the laws fail you, when the politicians fail you, when the system clicks on an empty chamber, you don't surrender. You switch weapons. You use your voice. You use your vote. You use your art. You use your community. You fight with whatever you have left. He proved that one man, alone in the dark, can stop an army. Imagine what we can do if we stand together in the light. The sun has set on the Argonne forest. The trenches are filled in. The trees have grown back, covering the scars of the artillery. But the ground is still sacred. It is salted with the blood of the 369th. As we end this broadcast, I want you to carry the image of Henry Johnson with you. Not the broken man on the street corner, but the warrior in the trench. Picture him. It is 3:00 a.m. The flare is dying. The Germans are coming. He is bleeding. He is outnumbered 20-1. He doesn't look for a way out. He looks for a target. That is the American spirit. That is the black spirit. That is the human spirit. We have dusted off the file. We have polished the star. We have brought the hero home. Now, the mission belongs to you. The algorithm of social media is a river that washes history away. It wants you to scroll. It wants you to forget. Do not forget. If this story made your heart race, if it made you angry, if it made you proud, you have a duty. You are now a member of the 369th. Share this video. Send it to a friend who needs courage. Send it to a teacher who needs truth. Post it on your timeline and declare that the Black Death is alive. And finally, I have one last request. A final roll call for the man who fought the world and won. We need to make his name ring out louder than the German guns. We need to fill the comment section with the title he earned in blood. Go to the comments right now. I want you to type the name that the French whispered in awe and the Germans screamed in terror. Type the Black Death. Let's build a digital monument that will stand for another 100 years. Let's show the ghost of Henry Johnson that his army is finally here. Private Henry Johnson, United States Army. Harlem Hellfighter. Medal of Honor recipient. You are relieved of duty. You can finally rest. Thank you for watching. Keep your blade sharp, keep your head up, and never let them take your history. Dismissed.